My name is David Padefor. I'll be moderating this panel. Here, okay? Is everyone here? Okay. Yeah, let's get started. It's really an honor to moderate this panel. This is about as interdisciplinary as one can imagine, and so I'll be giving brief introductions. It's also an honor to be part of this celebration and also really to celebrate Tinsley Oden's contributions and the contributions of the Oden Institute, and then look to the future. And the only regret is that Tinsley Oden is not here to celebrate with us. I did want to say that when I was asked to moderate this panel, the biggest challenge was thinking of an interdisciplinary group to get together and to really reveal for the audience all of the richness of potential for the future of computational methods, mathematical methods for solving some of the deepest and hardest problems in physiology and medicine. If you just look at a simple metric like how many Nobel Prizes in physiology and medicine were related to computational and mathematical models, I can only think of two. And I'll give you extra credit if you can think of what those are.
I think there's only two in chemistry also.
Yeah. So really I want to just give a very brief few minutes before we really open it up for discussion. A few really highlights of the foundations, the scientific and quantitative foundations of theoretical medicine. Really, we go back to Walter Cannon, 1939, The Wisdom of the Body, a very famous book on the natural laws underlying functional homeostasis of living systems, self-regulating processes by which a biological system maintains stability while adjusting to changing environmental conditions. Cannon was also a practicing physician, and he was very passionate about teaching quantitative methods at Harvard Medical School during his career. And he coined the term homeostasis. Alan Turing, 1952, on the structural homeostasis of living matter. Of course, everyone in this room knows about Alan Turing's contributions in computation, but not as many folks may know about his contributions to the concept of structural homeostasis in living matter. Several Max Planck institutes are devoted to this. It's a very, very interesting area that has unique mathematical requirements for understanding. And then some of our heroes as physicians. I am a professor of neurology. I practice. I also do science work. And every day I think of William Osler's teachings, the founder of three areas, really. The founder of theoretical foundations of scientific medicine, the founder of the clinical method at the bedside, and the founder of what we call modern medical education, and the argument for the medical center as the laboratory of observation. He wasn't the only one who did that, but he was one of the first and really came to Hopkins to launch this experiment, which now has gone across the United States as really a very important model. I just want to make two quotes, and then I will get to the panel discussion. Osler said, quote, "Medicine is learned by the bedside and not in the classroom. Let not your conceptions of disease come from words heard in the lecture room or read from the book. See and then reason and compare and control, but see first." And then his other famous quote in this area, "Observe, record, tabulate, communicate. Use your five senses. Learn to see, learn to hear, learn to feel, learn to smell, and know that by practice you can become expert." Sounds like ChatGPT to me, right? I mean, there is an Osler-Turing test, by the way, is not only can you emulate what an expert clinician would say, but can you explain to the patient why you came to that diagnosis and treatment. So it's explainability and diagnosis, and that is the Osler-Turing test. So I wanted to just briefly go around the room and explain why we really felt strongly that this was the right panel for this discussion. I'll just go right across. Joshua Chang was an engineer first, worked on communication, MIT graduate, worked in communications, missile tracking, Lincoln Labs, and then many of you should talk to him about the epiphany he had to become a physician scientist, and then got an MD, PhD, combined degree with a PhD in quantitative health sciences, where mechanistic understanding, machine learning intersect with medicine. Michael Sachs is an engineer scientist, I would say, and I've learned a lot from him, not only linear algebra, but the importance of tensors in understanding. Many of you know Michael Sachs very well, and the work is amazing work on the heart and the cardiovascular system, and hopefully the cerebrovascular system. Tom Yankeloff is another engineer scientist and together an incredible tour de force in the digital twin concept as it might relate to personalized medicine. A lot of excitement in that area in medicine, and that will be, I'm sure, a part of the discussion. And Tom, I've learned a lot from as well, including the importance of touring in one of the lectures that he's given in cancer pathogenesis, and he's done some incredible work in that. Claudia Lucanetti is one of my heroes that was long before I met her. In fact, talk about somebody who was a physician scientist who actually impacted the care of patients, literally how the immune system affects the body, specifically the nervous system. A week will not go by when I'm on service when I'm not thinking about some of Dr. Lucanetti's contributions in immunology as it relates to specific patients. So, and not only was she a hero to me as a physician scientist long before we met, but now she's here as our dean at the helm to lead us to the next decade and beyond for the UT Austin Medical Center. So we're really happy that she's here and able to also be on this panel. She's also Senior Vice President for Medical Affairs for the University of Texas at Austin. And then very proud to have Allie Richardson on the panel. There are no graduates of the computational medicine program from Oden, but she is one of the leading edge computational medicine portfolio graduate students. So we're really looking to her for the future of education in the program. And she kindly did a survey of colleagues with Dr. Sachs's direction, and she will be reporting to this group for discussion. So without further delay, I'm really excited to start the questions, and then I'll keep quiet. So first question is, what is computational medicine from the perspective of the scientist, the engineer, the physician, the patient, the clinic, and the payers? Everybody's got a different definition of what is computational medicine. Computational prowess is important for all of these elements. So why don't we start with our clinician scientist?
Would that be me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, just from a standard definition, the way I think of computational medicine from a physician perspective, I think it's of a science that depends on modeling, quantitative analysis, computer simulations of problems in the medical field, with major, really clinical problems being the primary research object, and that computer and application software are sort of the tools to really be able to drive toward clinical applications. Doctors, just now on a perspective of how we treat and diagnose, we tend to look to the past. We tend to look at population level information. We tend to look at clinical trials on groups of patients to inform our decisions around diagnosis, around treatment, around behavior. And I think really this view of shifting from that model going forward to really thinking about how we'll begin, and we'll hear more from Tom and others, to use the digital twins, where we can have not only the patient, the human patient, but the virtual patient. And that combination, to be able to draw these insights about what might lie in store for patients in terms of what would be the right treatment or the right course or the right operation or the right management plan, that's going to fundamentally shift. So I see computational medicine from the perspective of a doctor, on the one hand, to be a transformative change in the field, and it's going to allow us to truly move toward medicine that is personalized and predictive. I would also add, it's a little daunting too, the Internet of Medical Things and the explosion of wearable devices and the ability to really monitor patients and patients to want to be monitored just with all these different devices that are out there. That's getting more and more sophisticated, and with that sophistication, we're able to detect not just heart rate or your PO2 when we all had COVID, but actually move forward to really detecting how your tremor is, or dampen your tremor, or assess your predilection for mental health crisis. What that means is, on the one hand, lots of data, but it's going to inundate us, and we are thinking a little bit ahead of how we're going to manage all this data in a way that we can impact the care of our patients in a meaningful way versus drowning in it. And then also already today, you get called about a lot of things from your patients, but imagine 24/7 streaming that's occurring from the home. A home will be the hospital. The hospital of the future sits with the sensors in the home, the sensors in the teeth, assessing what you've eaten, the environment around you, and how that's impacting you, and then the health behaviors prior to disease and with disease. That will really be transformative. So computational medicine is the key that will unlock a door, but in that process of how it's going to impact us, we have a lot to learn and adapt and adjust to, but excited to do that.
Great, thank you. So maybe I'll set up a discussion of the three engineer scientists. We have also a physician engineer scientist, but also the engineer scientist. So why don't we start with Tom? How would you think of it, and maybe Michael, the two of you can address the same question.
The question is our definition.
How do you view it, and how? Yeah.
I think I have a pretty simple definition. It's using mathematics and simulation to model human health and disease. Like that's a succinct definition of computational medicine. What it's used for can explode like some of the awesome things you just said. So that's my succinct definition. You give it a go?
Yeah, I'd be a little bit different because I think there's what I've seen sometimes is a confusion between computational life sciences, computational biology, and computational medicine. And I see medicine as ultimately affecting patient care. Okay, so for example, like one really good example is the explosion of medical imaging, particularly that's been for many years. And a radiology colleague of mine up at UT Southwestern said we use about 1/10 of 1% of the information that's in those images. I mean, and then, but once you can glean out of that computationally and then use it to diagnose and then predict optimal treatments and say for this patient, this is the best way to do it today. And then that leads into the digital twin, which I think is another topic. But for me, that's really what I see it. So I think a distinction from, say, computational pathophysiology or computational physiology, they're related, but medicine is ultimately about patient treatment.
Great, thank you. Joshua.
I agree with everything that was said. I'm not sure. The other way I would add to it, I guess, is that I think computational medicine at the end of the day is still, as Dr. Sachs and Dr. Lucanetti said, how we deal with our patients, how do we interact with our patients. And I think it expands on our understanding of medicine from the perspective that we can now build models and understand mechanistically what's going on underneath all the signals that we're getting. So we're getting a ton of signals out from wearables. Almost, everyone's got a smartwatch or smartphone that's collecting data all the time. And so how do we leverage that, not in a black box way, but in a way that's actually giving us insight into underlying mechanisms of what's going on in order to do better therapeutics, better diagnostics. And the other thing that I would also say is I see computational medicine, I think Dr. Sachs, you alluded to this, in terms of how do we understand, how do we optimize treatment protocols, for instance, right? Instead of us having to test a bunch of different protocols on each individual, like we do right now with different medications, because we're not sure which one they're going to respond to, could we build these digital twin models that Dr. Yankelov has been working on so that we can gain some insights before and then kind of go into a clinical setting with the patient a little bit more aware of what's going on by taking our understanding of physiology and creating these models that are able to then simulate or test out what's going to be beneficial. So I see computational medicine really as how do we improve and work and partner with the clinical teams in order to optimize both diagnostics and therapeutics.
So you get the last word, Ellie. You took a survey, actually, of those who are in the program. How did they view competition? Is it aligned with the way we're defining it?
I would definitely say so. I would say a lot of the students view it as the interface between computational engineering and then applying it to the medical field. I will say before I started grad school, I had never heard of the term computational medicine. I definitely think that's an emergent thing. And I think the importance of separating that from the more general mathematical biology that might be very broad encompassing, and just making especially undergraduates and new graduate students aware of computational medicine and the impact that can actually have to the patients is really important.
Great, thank you. Well, the next question is a really hard question. In fact, I draw inspiration from Professor Wilcox's comment of 1973. Just seemed like, really? It's going to be a big lift, right? Just, we have these computers. How are we going to actually transform the world around us? I mean, right now when I look around us, I see the Oden Institute everywhere, in the planes, in the buildings, in the cars, everything, the finite element method, the theoretical foundations of numerical simulation that converge to an analytic solution, all of that, I see it. But what about the world within us? How are we going to get there? The body's very complicated. So here's the question. How will computational medicine transform healthcare? How can UT lead that effort over the next decade? So I'm going to start with Tom.
Sure. Well, thanks.
You're good at working on hard problems.
Sure. There's actually two things I think about UT that kind of put us at a really good place for doing this. One is everything you just listed, that we have the Oden Institute. So you can't swing a dead cat in here without hitting some, you shouldn't swing a dead cat. But if you were to do that, you couldn't.
Schrodinger's cat?
Yeah, it's here all week.
Could be alive.
I'm trying to make a point here, David. Right. It's very difficult to swing your arms.
Moderated now.
So there's lots of expertise in this building, both in the foundations of computational modeling, but also what's really cool about our medical school, at least my understanding of how it was set up, it was that it was designed to partner with community providers from the word go. So at least in the context of oncology, it's about 85% of patients get their care at community providers. Most people don't go to the MD Andersons, the Hopkins, the Michigans, the UCS of the world. They go to these community providers. And so the notion of being able to link advanced computational medicine and get it out of the academic ivory tower onto Main Street to have a real impact on large chunks of the population, that's pretty unique. And the other thing that's really important here is, we've talked about this, when you have an established engineering and the computational program that we have here, and you have a relatively new medical school coming up, there's a small window of time where you can get these two groups of people to work together, and then otherwise it's like every other institution where there's a wall or a highway in some places going through those two things. And so it's almost a moral obligation that we have to do that. So when I think about what UT can do to lead, those are the two things. We have the access to state-of-the-art computation in terms of both brain power and the resources through tech. And then we have a new medical school who, at least partially, the vision is to partner with community providers. So we could get stuff out of the academic ivory tower onto Main Street. That's a real unique thing we have here.
Thanks. No, that was great. So I'm going to make it even more difficult by asking the next layer, which is, how do you see the role of fundamental natural science and mechanism-based modeling, which is what Oden Institute's famous for, and especially in mechanics, versus the role of big data, AI, black box approaches? And then how can you integrate those to get to the personalized digital twin? Michael.
Take a shot at that first?
Well, no, I'm calling on you.
Oh, I thought it was talking.
No, I'm calling on you.
You look a lot alike.
No, I gave him, he's sweating.
Wait your turn.
I want him to recover. So now
Okay.
I'm calling on you, Mike.
Yeah, that's always, it's a painful process because there's the fundamental, I want to understand everything before I do anything part of you. And then there's the reality where you realize you don't know anything. And so, but I think what I try to do, my view is they're not mutually exclusive. And in fact, the physics-based, so much of the work we've done on the heart, for example, was spent on decades of working on fundamental animal-based models and these types of models, this one, and now we're able to use that leverage to understand how to apply it to what's in the clinic based on what we know that's measurable in the clinic, but we fill in the other stuff we can from population-based information. And then some of that's this physics-based stuff, and some of it's just information-based work. And from those, you can find, what's really nice about that, you can find areas where there's a hole, but you have an idea of what that hole looks like and what the characteristics of it are. And then from that, you can guide the next set of studies to find out how to fill that in. So it's, and I think what I've always been taken from this, where it has to go is what you've told me. I've been very influenced with what you said, which is use the clinic as the laboratory, which for me is a totally opposite way I was trained. I was trained, you do the fundamental work, you don't get in near the clinic until you have everything worked out with the 20 decimal places. And actually find out, actually you can learn so much more about what's really going on in the human pathology just by analyzing what's going on and then trying to model that, let alone anything else. So I think in terms of where I think it needs to go, I think I'll let Ali take care of the training side of it, but I think it's really about learning to not only train the right kind of people with the right breadth, but it has to go in the sense of helping clinicians make decisions and also long-term prognoses. That to me is it's absolutely critical to everything that I do. And I think that's where because if a clinician who's trained to measure something and correlate it with something, and Tom comes and no, here's a model of it, and it'll tell you what to do this, and once they see the value, they eat it up, and then that becomes part of their standard of care.
Well, I want to ask Joshua's opinion because he's actually done both. He's done sort of bench to bedside work, and he's done bedside inspired science back. So maybe you could reflect on the same question from your perspective as a both physician and scientist and engineer.
So I think, like was said earlier, I think both of these things work synergistically together, and we have to think about it that way. So the work that I've done with Dr. Pedafar before on optimizing stimulus waveform therapeutics for people with different types of neurological disorders. We've used evolutionary algorithms to find optimal waveform parameters and stimulus structures. But by itself, that doesn't give us very much insight as to what's actually happening underneath. Why is that waveform unique? Why is that waveform useful? Why is it energetically optimal? And so we've always gone back to our models. We've gone back to basic understandings of neuronal preparations, looking at Hodgkin-Huxley models, for instance, to understand mechanistically how does this optimized waveform that we've developed using evolutionary algorithms, using AI techniques, how does that work, and why does it work the way it does, and do we gain insights? And I think those insights are important because then that's how we're able to then generalize those findings to another patient, to another type of neuronal population, for instance. And so it is this back and forth where I think AI holds a lot of potential, machine learning holds a lot of potential for finding solutions that we might not be able to derive our way to. But then, taking that back to our understanding of the mechanisms, our understanding of how these systems work, allows us then to build the explainable portions of it. Or we might realize that our fundamental models are a little bit off, and so then therefore that gives us insights into how do we improve on the models that we're using.
So I attended, Dr. Lucanetti, one of your recent lectures just yesterday, actually, and you started off with a patient who inspired you to understand the cause of their death. And that led to a whole journey with the discovery of how the immune system was perturbed, how we can see it, we can visualize it, and yes, even quantify it with many of the graphs. So maybe you could give us some insights of how, as a clinician, it felt Oslerian to me. But maybe I don't want to, what's your...
Well, maybe before I jump to the personal, I want to take one step back and just comment about something. I came from an environment of 30 years at the Mayo Clinic that had the most vibrant clinical environment, all integrated, all great, but lacked the depth and quality and expertise that sits in this room. I went about a strategy of hiring the AI architect, the AI engineer, the computer scientist, trying to build a team in neurology as a chair to launch a neurology AI platform, recognizing that there was no way that we would ever move from a model to impact without bringing the interdisciplinary team to bear to the situation. What would draw me here is just the power of what is the convergence of talent around compute and around analysis, huge. But just like Mayo didn't have as much of that compute analyze, they had all the applied, the environment for translate and apply is being built. We're building a new hospital or expanding that footprint, but you cannot translate and apply without really, as you said, Tom, getting into the real world. And the reality is that the application of AI in healthcare is going to require the domain expertise. The clinician and the scientist and the computer engineer and the mathematician all have to be traveling, not just in the beginning, not just in the middle, not just at the end, throughout the life cycle. They have to understand each other's languages enough to be able to speak and hear one another. The clinician has to, it's not just an assumption or an idea clinically. They know the problems, they know the issues, and you need a live synchronous environment, not only to stand something up and see how it behaves, and then you need a validation environment to see does it actually return on what you thought it was going to do, and a quality management system to keep watching this loop and see is it going to start to change. But knowing the power that's here and the potential, what's possible going forward, I think it is unique. I would just add one other layer to that. The tech environment that surrounds this city and the interest that tech has within this space is huge. But the silos between academia, between the clinical practice and the tech industry are real. But I think our potential in this city at this time And the leapfrog potential that exists is why I'm convinced that despite not having a data strategy here, despite the decentralized, fragmented world that we live in, particularly here in Texas around data, I'm convinced we can leapfrog because of the talent that's here. And so Jim Berard, last comment I would say, is a venture capitalist here in Austin, and he talks about collisions of brilliance, creating environments for those collisions of brilliance and staying on track for what your goal ultimately is. Papers are important, grants are important, teaching is important, but in the medicine space, are you going to improve patient outcome? Are you going to reduce cost? Are you going to improve patient and doctor experience? Are you going to increase efficiency? And if you hold yourself accountable to those, the potential is limitless, but you can get kind of along the way. Now, as far as a personal level, you know, we look at patients with MS, we try to figure out, you know, how they're going to behave. We have really, you know, it's like a crystal ball, you're trying to figure it out. The transformative efforts of what comes around the predictive space, the predictive analytics, the clinical decision support, the personalized treatment, decision making, the real-time monitoring, the streamlined operations, all that's going to be transformed by AI ML. So my job, your job when we're in the clinic, theoretically should allow us to spend less time looking at our computer and more time looking at our patient to really bring the humanistic side back to where a world transformed by technology hasn't historically made it easier for us. Every time something new has been brought in the clinic, like an electronic medical record, it's pure hell for the clinicians and everyone else. So now the chance to make it easier for us is going to be an important part of this too.
Well, that was great. I mean, in fact, in a nutshell, you answered the question I had, but also you preempted the next two questions, which is what are some of the barriers for advancing computational medicine, which you just summarized beautifully. But I did want to go around and see if there were any other thoughts on the barriers, you know, that we might want to think about as a problem itself that we can solve, you know. Michael.
Yeah, one of them I think is a very academic cultural one, because you always ask yourself a question, who are you doing this for? And the answer is, oh, for the other people doing something just like it, so I can show I'm smarter than they are, right? Absolutely, you know, my impact factor went up more than they did, you know. But the reality is we're not doing it for any of that. We're doing it for, like, as Claudia said, it's to improve patient care. And I think one of the things that, particularly for more academic people like us, need to kind of adjust our thinking is that it's very much that kind of outcomes based. It's what you said, the impact is ultimately improving patient care, cost structures, and all those things. That's sometimes a little hard for a lot of academics to digest.
Well, this gets perfectly to the last item, which will be, Ali and Michael, I really would like, you know, how will we train the workforce of the future to lead this transformation? And it's a workforce that's in academia, it's a workforce that's in industry, it's medical care environments. How can we position ourselves? And maybe we could start with some of the survey results that you and Dr. Sachs worked on.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the Oden Institute is really well situated in training very strong computational engineers in the backgrounds and algorithms that are needed to apply to medicine. I think what we really need to think about is how are we going to now bridge those gaps with these computational engineers who maybe haven't had the physiology background to understand the models previously, and how do we teach them in graduate school and have more offerings of physiology courses specifically geared towards engineers. A lot of the courses that are offered are very medical based and assume you have a lot of medical background, which engineers or computational engineers usually don't. I definitely didn't. So I think having the proper courses offered to be able to teach our trainees how to communicate with clinicians and actually understand the problems that are happening. I think another big thing on how we train our clinicians, or how we train our computational engineers, is getting them in the environments that the clinicians are in. So actually visiting the hospitals and how is the data being collected, whether it's imaging data or vital sign data, because whatever models you eventually develop and algorithms and maybe alert systems that you want the clinicians to implement, how are those clinicians going to implement those procedures into their rounds, and how are they actually going to work into their workflow and have an impact on patient care? Which I think are things that we need to think about while training.
Michael?
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. I think it's also, you know, myself, many years ago, when the glaciers were just melting when I was an undergraduate, and we had to avoid mammoths on the Michigan State University campus. I chose, my first 2 degrees are in engineering mechanics with minors in math, but then for my PhD, I chose to go into biomedical engineering because I felt like I had the math and mechanics down pretty well. There's always more to learn, but it was the domain knowledge that I was missing. And it was my graduate work working in a heart-lung interaction lab that I really understood how to bring them together and what the problems were. And I think that's kind of an experience. The question is, how do you do that in a graduate program, particularly one like the CSEM, which is extremely rigorous. And so a lot of it is like we have students, like some of my students work with the clinicians at Dell. They go over to see them. We have collaborations, all that kind of good stuff. So it's really through examples and research, but there may be also some specific coursework. It's a very unique opportunity because there is not a comparable program in the United States that I'm aware of that really combines computational science and engineering with medicine. And that's very unique.
Well, I wanted to ask Dr. Chang because you chose a path where you integrated both quantitative sciences and medicine, both, as a single training program. It was a combined MD PhD. It was what many would call the MSTP program, which is an NIH-funded program, where it's really 1 degree, but it's integrated. And what is the advantage, disadvantage of that approach, where you got to do what Allie's talking about? You got to take the courses that could lead to clinical practice if you wanted to, versus 2 different specialists collaborating with each other. Like if you just chosen to just stick with one or the other and then collaborate with the other. How do you view that? Because we don't, what's the advantage of an integrated, let's just call it an MD/PhD program, which is what you did?
Yeah. So I could start with a disadvantage. It is twice as long. It's a long journey. But I would say there's a number of advantages I think that I've experienced, and I'm still learning. Someone had once given me the analogy that if you've had your steak with salt, you've never realized the impact or the importance of salt on your steak. And there's a part of me that's wondering if, because I've had this privilege of having the MD PhD, it's hard for me to immediately compare to what it would have been like if I only had the MD or the PhD. But one thing I would say that I have noticed when I've been working and collaborating with other people is I think that there is an extra measure of learning, like Dr. Sachs was saying, for people that have just done the research, but need to then learn a little bit more about the clinical stuff. I would say that Dr. Sachs probably knows more about the heart than I do. Dr. Yankelov probably more about cancer than I do at this point. But one thing I think the MD degree gives me, at least, is a very broad education in all of physiology, in all of medicine. And as was said, I think you also had quoted earlier, one thing that I also appreciate is that there is a difference between just learning all of this head knowledge and then also seeing patients that have had it in the clinic. My knowledge of certain diseases has grown because of me physically working up a patient on the wards, and then associating that now with a certain disease. I'm no longer thinking about it just in terms of a mechanistic perspective, but also from a patient's lived-in experience of this disease. And so how do I think about this? How do I address a more holistic perspective on this particular individual? The other side of it is, I think, in medical school, we don't learn the quantitative side of things as much. And I think that is an unfortunate piece of medicine. We have one class on physiology, and I think that was the one class I was most excited about because there were math equations. And I was definitely the minority in my class. But there's so much of our understanding is wrapped up in understanding these equations, understanding how things work. When we give these treatments, how does it impact the body? And I think, at least the way I was trained, most of that was done through, you just associated these words together. You associated constellations of symptoms, and then that was associated with this disease, and that's associated with this treatment. And so then being able to take that and think about it computationally, I think, by having that PhD and thinking about it a certain way, that allows me to reorient or rethink the way I consider or approach these problems. The other thing I would say I've noticed is I've realized when you have people that are specialized in their fields, they could be using the same English words, but they're talking about different things. And so I've had the privilege of working with people that are computer science professors and physiologists, and they're talking about models, and we're building this one predictive modeling to try to anticipate falls, for instance, human gait and balance issues. And the physiologist is talking about falls from the perspective of modeling the fundamental motion equations and how can we predict and anticipate based off of treating a human being as an inverted pendulum. And our computer science colleagues are thinking about LSTM models and how do we build better forecasting recurrent neural net models. And so they're arguing back and forth about models, but they're using models in different ways. And so being able to be at that intersection and realize that, hey, we're talking right past each other here has been one thing that I think has been beneficial to having this education across the board.
Great, thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes before the coffee break, so we could open it up to the audience for our panelists. Any questions?
So very interesting. Let's talk. So my brother-in-law is a surgeon, a general surgeon. My son's a neonatologist. So as I listen to you, I think about in 10 years, will we not need radiologists? Will minor, maybe major surgery be done remotely or, just autonomously? In case of my son, his fellowship work was essentially putting a fit on a young infant to try to understand the correlation of motions with prognosis. So what's your view? I mean, just sort of two examples, but in 10 years, how is computation going to replace, in maybe a bad way, the physician's insight?
Oh, yeah, I think there'd be several perspectives on that great question. One perspective I have is that I'm already seeing an impact on high performance computing on split-second decisions that we just don't have time to think about it. Like our brain, there's thinking fast and there's thinking slow. And thinking slow is very intuitive and very complex, and there's a lot of subjectivity that has to come into it, gut feelings. Should I take the COVID vaccine or not? The data says yes, but I don't understand it. All those things. You have time to think about it. You can consult with different experts. But the split-second decisions, should the ambulance turn right or left to go to this hospital or that hospital? What should we do about something like right this second? And there are 5 alarms going on. So high-performance computing and advanced edge computing are revolutionary, and we are totally unutilizing it right now. So I can see that. I mean, believe me, nurses and physicians would be very grateful if we could solve that, because they got other things to do. They need to be thinking about their patients. They need to be meeting with the families and communicating with them and educating the families on what's going on. So I think there's plenty of room, plenty of things to work on. I just gave one example of the split second that already I can see that that's needed, and it will happen. But maybe I'll go around and see, Michael?
Yeah, so I would say in 10 years, I think the biggest issue is the prognosis, like what's going to happen. So most of cardiac surgery is very, and I hope there's no cardiac surgeons in this audience, I'm going to get myself in trouble. You train to be a cardiac surgeon from many years of sheer caseload. It's just brute force experience. And you know in your head how it's going to work. They're very good at getting the patient out of the hospital. After that, we don't know. And then there's, endless trials. And my students and I go to these heart valve meetings and cardiac meetings, and I'll spend the whole day watching, here's the current status of such and such repair, and I get 20 lectures from top flight surgeons. Everyone's different. Everybody, whatever they do it's perfect. It works great for them, except it doesn't work for the other guy. They do it this way. And what do you do? So I think that's kind of where it's going. It's where the digital twin concept comes in, because you can kind of see where it's going, and then the models become more cognizant of what's going on and what the patterns are. We know much more about the specifics of that patient and what's going on exactly with them that causes this repair method to work well here but not good here. That sounds very basic, but actually we don't know. And that's where I see in 10 years, I think that's very realistic.
Dr. Lucanetti.
I'll be bold enough to say that I don't view that AI is going to replace surgeons or the healthcare workforce, but the healthcare workforce and surgeons and physicians who don't know AI will be replaced. Now, with that statement, it needs to be clear there are a very limited number of actually point-of-care adopted solutions into medicine that, so we've got still a long way to go. Having said that, we have to be very intentional about how we're educating, how we're learning the benefits, limitations. The issue of trust is huge. When an AI algorithm fails, or you can't explain it, it's not explainable AI, and your patient, you're used to saying, we're going to do this drug because it does this, and we know this, and we don't really know. The issue of trust is a huge one, and that's going to be something because the outcome, if it doesn't work, could be fatal. That was proven with Epic, and another group had released all this sepsis, to look at infections, alarms going off everywhere, wrong signals, wrong outcomes, patients dying, wonderful algorithm that they pull off and then have to start over again. So that is going to be really, the bar is different. It's not an area under the curve. It's, does it actually do what it says it does, and then how is it going to change with all these new inputs? The other thing is we as physicians and healthcare workforce have to be able to advocate for policy changes, et cetera. That'll be important. And to the point you said, Ali, we have to become adept at working with human-machine teams. How do you optimize a human-machine team? How are we training around that? And then finally, how do we get some of the courses you mentioned, Joshua, around computer science, health informatics, data, understanding how algorithms are constructed. What are they about? It can't just be this abstract concept around, well, even just a familiarity with what's involved with it. And so from my standpoint, there will be parts replaced. Right now, our patient, ChatGPT just scored an 85 percentile on the USFLE. So, it can do that. But, and we have to be ready to see how it will amplify what we can do. But if we get into that position that we think it's going to replace what we're going to do, it's not going to really be productive. It will replace certain aspects, and those are probably good things to replace. If I don't have to actually dictate a note about a patient, and Epic can naturally, with the ambient thing, turn it into a note, and now I can actually start thinking about how to use that, or it can identify several things I didn't otherwise pick up, that should amplify, not replace. But there's going to be parts of it that I think are going to be revolutionary, and we have to be ready and hang on and do our best.
Dr. Yankelov.
You can call me Professor Yankelov, right?
Well, you're also a doctor. You teach, don't you teach? Doesn't a doctor mean teach?
It's a teach, right? Latin, right?
Is that a real doctor or just a medicine?
It's a real doctor.
I have forgotten what I was going to say. But it's come back to me. I've put it in my mind vice. I'm going to crush it now. The other thing about what AI is going to replace. So I think I'm the only person I know who has not drunk the AI Kool-Aid. Even people in our lab are coming and saying, shouldn't we try a neural net on this? And I vomit a little bit in my mouth every time. So I think there are certain just absolutely fundamental limitations on the AI big data approach to solving problems, particularly in oncology. Particularly, it's because the disease is so very heterogeneous over all temporal and spatial scales. And when it particularly comes to the problem of prognosis, like Michael was talking about, a patient just doesn't get cancer, right? Depending on how you parse it up, it's somewhere north of 100 different diseases. So Miss Jane Doe doesn't present with cancer, or even breast cancer, or even triple-negative breast cancer. It's one of the 6 current known subtypes of triple-negative breast cancer. So if you want to make a prognosis on her, you have to find a training data set that has that. And then in that training data set has all the possible therapeutic regimens you could give Miss Jane Doe. That training set doesn't exist, and it will never exist because the diseases are getting more and more specific, and the therapeutic options are getting more, the biochemists and molecular biologists building more and more specific ones. And also, that's just not, that's philosophy or whatever. It's we've tried this, right? If you Google Watson Oncology failure, you will get a gazillion hits from all the top journals, from Forbes to JAMA to New England Journal of Medicine. All these things have different takes on it, but it's all the same thing. And it's the notion of I'm just going to take the data and the computer, the network will calibrate a gazillion it's never going to happen.
Agreed.
Well, you got, very spirited. Maybe we have time for one more question.
I was wondering if the panelists could just briefly speak about how they see the role of digital twin technology in personalized medicine, and specifically how we should best collect the data. Maybe to start off that question, how long do you think, how many years until most people will be running around with chip implants that track and collect personal data?
So maybe since you've gotten to know the panel well, why don't you call on who you would like to answer that?
No, let the panelists decide. Whoever wants to take a stab at somebody specific.
Okay, well, why don't we just start? Allie, how would you answer that?
Yeah. That's a big one. I would say it really does come back a lot to the trust that Dr. Lucanetti mentioned with the patient as well, in terms of what people want to be tracked. In terms of everybody just walking around with a chip, I think that the data security definitely has to be an issue, and just getting access to that data for the digital twins, to create the digital twins, is definitely one of the barriers. I don't know if we mentioned a lot of the data, especially health data, is either on a hospital firewall, and we have to get the hospital administration excited about the things that we can actually achieve with our computational models and effects that we can have on patients, to be able to get access to that data, and specifically get access to that data within the realm of high performance computing. So not only can our computational engineers access the data, but do they have the computational resources to run the models on that large data, which I definitely think is a barrier that we're going to have to achieve before we can get to the complete digital twins.
Yeah, I would maybe make a slight variation, but that was a real wattful. Okay, so as I said earlier, I don't see a distinction necessarily between the two physics domain and the information domain. It's just ways of, this is what Tinsley Oden was very good at. He said, computation is the third leg of science, experimental, theoretical, now it's computation. So if you think of it that way, which I think is a very reasonable, it keeps you sane, okay? But the way I look at it is, somebody came up with this term a few years ago called precision medicine. And I'm like, well, what have we been doing before? And I'm like, boy, I'm glad I never had to go to get any surgery, But but I think really what it boils down to is physics-based or mechanism-based, the way I turn the word, is like what Tom said, and we run into the same thing. You need to understand what's going on in the body under these pathologies. Information by itself is not going to do that for you. At the same time, there's lots of stuff that you can get that can help you like fill in things that you don't know yet. Okay, and if you look at it that way, you can refine, what computation allows you to do is to refine those predictions, much in the same way, to use an old analogy, we've all seen the hurricane predictions, right? And I'm very sensitive because my daughter lives in Orlando now, and every time there's a hurricane, I get all these phone calls. But it's like, initially the hurricanes they could predict where in the northern hemisphere it was going to end, which hemisphere was it going to be in, right? And then it got better and better and better. And that was a combination of grand circuit models, computational work, people work at NOAA, some of the people done here in the Oden Institute, and then also satellite data, ocean temperatures, all the stuff that's coming in, and collectively, that's the word, collectively, our predictions got much, much, much better. Now they're extremely good. So if you think of that as an analog to what can happen potentially in healthcare, you could imagine kind of where that can go. And that's kind of the way I see it.
So we have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to kind of a different angle to your question, which is kind of almost like, how do you get started? We talked about the 10-year, like how can we make an impact over a long period, but how do you get started? I mean, if you think of it as two vast areas that are not well connected right now, one being medicine, the other one is high-performance computing that helps really impact patients, which everybody seems to agree that that's important. Is it a footbridge? Is it a super highway that we're building between these two pieces? How are we going to get started? Like, I think that you're asking, like, what kind of data should we get started on? And I'd like Dr. Lucanetti to help us with that one. How do you get started?
Well, let me just, I think there's a really important role that already happens with kind of grassroots decentralized innovation, which is really a lot of the environment here. And then there's the structure of medicine and kind of how you're going to bridge that chasm. And I think you get started by bringing those multi-purpose teams together. You create those collisions where you're actually being sure you can take examples where you've defined the goal up front and you kind of really work collaboratively through to the point of impact and adoption. You also recognize that the data involves multiple institutions, multiple nations. Like, we're going to work on these small pieces of data, and they're going to give us some insights, which will be good. But in medicine, you will not adopt, you will not implement until, one, you understand the barriers to implementation, and two, you have some strategy around your data. And I don't really think the data will be housed in these fixed architectures. They'll travel with the patient. The patient will have agency. So how will we connect with patients that are part of this, so we can follow them through their continuum of life? But having said that, how you get started here, you bring medicine into this space. You bring what it means to actually, what are the problems of medicine, and you catalyze the combination of the analyze and the compute with the translate and apply, and you create some real world examples. So when Tom says to me, what does he need to do to bring his digital twins into real world? I come back and say, well, we got to create a clinical environment for you to validate that stuff to see if it even is going to work. So we talk, we figure out, well, what do we actually do to make that happen? So you start to deliver on the promise by starting to really have some concrete, intentional ways of moving it forward.
Well, thank you.
He wants to say something.
We got to stop. We got to stop.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that it's kind of ironic that we're having this meeting today, because we're actually, Andrea has to be in this. Yes, Andrea and I have been texting and emailing back and forth. We're desperately trying to submit this extremely large NIH PO1 today. It comes in at 684 pages. Right? We're waiting for one more piece of paper to go in so we can submit the thing. And it's all on digital twins and breast, brain, and prostate cancer. And what we've learned over the last 4,000 years of doing this project is that I don't think it's a technical limitation. You asked about 10 years. I don't think we have to do more technical developments to refine things we do. But the biggest thing is going to be convincing patients and their treating physicians that this is a worthwhile topic. How do you present this data to patients? This is where you are now. Here's your digital twin that suggests we should do this. Then you'll go and do that. Then you'll get more measurements. You'll update your twin, and they talk back to each other. How do you communicate that to somebody? That's foreign to most humans. Mm-hmm. And how do you get, there's tremendous inertia in medicine. How do you, for good reason. So how do you communicate these predictions? As soon as you say the word simulate to most people, they think fake. As soon as you think theory, that's a vague concept. It's not something that's grounded in mathematics. So it's the communication, you have to go through, the communication, I think, is the fundamental bottleneck here. You have to engage patient advocates to go through their communities so that they can teach these notions to patients to really get true acceptance.
No, I think that these comments are incredibly important, because this is the first time I have ever been at a place like the Oden Institute with this kind of panel discussion. So I think this is the way to get started. Having this conversation and discussing it very openly and honestly of how we can actually make an impact on patients by looking at both mechanism-based and data-based, and embracing every tool in the armamentarium, inventing new tools if we need to, but taking the ones that already exist, as you've said. I think this is it. I mean, I agree, and I feel like this really resonates with me. Thank you very much.